So hello and welcome to another episode of the Sacred Wisdom Podcast. We are in a slightly different setup today because we have got together because we would like to answer some questions from you. We've gone after over the last 6 videos of what you've seen on Tartaria and picked out some comments, and you'll see the questions were laid up on the screen, and the first question was in the migration from Tartaria video, and it was from a Junior Chaves. This was saying, Stephen, was saying this person stated that the orphan chained children were inhabitants of Great Tartaria, hands down. So do you think it was hands down? Because I think there was a lot more to it. They weren't all from Great Tartaria, were they?
No, that's a bit of a generalisation. In fact, actually, large numbers of the children that went in, both as parentless children and with fathers and mothers from places like Great Tartaria, right, in northern Russia, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, were from many different regions, obviously. Yeah. So if you look at, for example, there were children in Eastern Europe from places like Poland, other countries such as Hungary and Bulgaria. And if you go across to Western Europe, like countries like France and Germany, Spain, Portugal and Italy, and they were taken on the freight liners and the passenger ships across to the harbour of New York City and throughout the eastern United States. Yeah, a large number of them were children from Great Tartaria.
I mean, it was only the northern Russian section, wasn't it? That was actually Tartaria at this point. Yeah, so people have to remember there was general migration from all the problems going on in Europe at the time as well, and the famines and stuff like this.
Well, so Great Tartaria, you had literally northern Tartaria, eastern Tartaria, southern Tartaria, or western Tartaria, but they were all geographically in northern Russia.
Right.
So they weren't really down in southwestern Russia, going down to places like Ukraine.
Yeah.
So no, it was mixed. The orphan train movement in the United States of America had a large number of children that you would class as saying having Turkic genetic ancestry from Great Tartaria, as well as Nordic Tartarian ancestry. But there were also many children from parts of Eastern Europe and Western Europe as well.
So the next comment on the same video was from a pure Aussie girl, and she says, don't forget Australia. There were a ton of orphanages, and here lots of orphans, and obviously you had the Fremantle show in Australia. But yeah, what about that? So
well, in Australia they were called the home children. That was a capital H and a capital C.
Right.
And in cities like Sydney and Melbourne and other cities such as Hobart and Darwin, there was huge amounts of children being brought in from places like the United Kingdom of Great Britain, as well as places like France and Belgium and Holland and Germany, and they were being transported into these cities like Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Perth, in Australia, and they were known as the home children. So that it was given a different sort of phrase. It was the same kind of motivation to transport these children from different geographic locations, bring them into the southern hemisphere, into the main cities of Australia. Who knows what was going on in terms of how that interrelated to the Industrial Revolution and the rights of those children, and who was adopting them, and perhaps the various elites and secret societies that were involved in that process.
I mean, you had the Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and obviously which have been decimated over the last 100 years, this would have contributed a lot to it. Obviously, a repopulation of white Anglo-Saxon type people coming into an Aboriginal country.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you take a look at the Aboriginal Australians, the Aborigines, and you look carefully at their genetic ancestry, the racial memory of where they came from, and obviously they've got genetic connections to the Tamil Dravidia and places like Tamil Nadu in southern India, and obviously in the Lemurian continent at the same time. So that cultural understanding was deliberately suppressed and censored, as with what was happening in Great Tartaria in northern Russia. So there was a multi-level coordination of deletion and censorship of the original Old World Empire, the Old World Order. And obviously the orphan train movement was a big part of that, because the youngest of the generations have to be, in their eyes, their perceptions of the elites and the secret societies had to be repurposed in terms of how they saw themselves, their upbringing, and how they could be integrated into this new order, this new way of doing things that was being developed at the time.
One of the most interesting things about the Aboriginals is that they're one of the only tribes in the world that didn't use any kind of hallucinogenics to reach a dream state. They used sound.
That's right.
So all their didgeridoos and the way they went into this kind of harmony.
Yes.
Incredible culture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Incredible. So the next question, same video, migration from Tartaria. This is from a Brian Whelan, and I'm studying the Tartarian understanding of the world. I'm struggling with the enormity of what is being suggested. One question, were the Tartarian giants or regular sized people, or were they both? And what happened to the giants?
Okay, so the Tartarian giants were a separate hominid species. Many of the females are anything from 8 to 9 feet in height, the males up to 10, 11, 12 feet in height. Now, they had a collaborative relationship with the Nordic Tartarians or Tartarian Aryans of northern Russia. So it was a very unique civilization, as we've mentioned before in previous Sacred Wisdom podcasts, where they actually worked together. Many of the Tartarian giants were actually operating the various kinds of anti-gravity occult technology that helped to construct many of the ornate edifices and healing temples of Great Tartaria northern Russia. Now, the second part of that is, what happened to the Tartarian giants? A lot of those Tartarian giants, their ancestral roots or origins are from the Polar Ural Mountains and the northern Ural Mountains in north-central Russia. When they saw the destruction occurring with the first mud flood, the second mud flood, the third mud flood, and obviously these Tartarian giants are extremely intelligent individuals, very psychic, very telepathic. They intuitively knew that they themselves were going to probably be in peril. It could be unsafe for them to exist on the surface of northern Russia, so they knew of the entrances, the various passageways into the Hollow Earth, and they descended into those areas in the Polar Urals and the northern Urals of North.
You can watch videos about Agartha and the Hollow Earth on the channel, guys. There's information about that. We have actually done a podcast on that as well. There is some or something down below us, 100%, and it's worth looking into before you make any decisions on what you believe on that. So, Steve, the next question is, and this is, there's been a lot of questions on these videos, but we've only homed in on the ones that we feel most important because they kind of answer themselves. One of the questions actually just say, we are brothers. Me and Stephen are brothers. We've been brothers for a long time, all our life actually. I thought the clue was in the surname. I mean, it was giving it away, but I didn't mention much about that, but we are brothers. And the last of all, this is the last question we addressed on this video. Well, it's not really a question. This is from creator Google account. Yes, imagination. I assume that is immigration. So yes, immigration into USA and North America, Canada and Mexico. But please don't forget Central and South America. What about Australia and New Zealand? We'll answer that.
So basically, if you look at Central America, so you look at cities like Tegucigalpa, which is in Honduras, and Managua in Nicaragua, as well as obviously I don't need to mention Mexico City in Mexico. Of course. And you look at other places in South America, such as Lima in Peru, Caracas in Venezuela, and then going down into Santiago in Chile, Buenos Aires in Argentina, for example. Yes, there was massive immigration waves that eventually went down from the United States of America, from the orphan train movement, and also many of their the actual children that were born from those individuals that were immigrants from Great Tartaria in northern Russia and Eastern Europe and Western Europe did start to go obviously into Central America, into those cities, and obviously the cities of South America. And at the same time as that, if there's any inferment there concerning remnants of Tartarian architecture in Central America, yes, there is a lot of evidence of old world empire buildings from Great Tartaria, the colonies of Great Tartaria in Central America, as there is in parts of South America, many of which now are very overgrown and what are known as the actual Amazon rainforest or the Amazon tropical forest.
We mentioned it before, but I have never looked into the Rio de Janeiro World Fair, but that is very surreal.
It is,
because that was a very remote part of the world at that time, and yet it was colonized. There was amazing ornate
wasn't a lot of easy transportation at that time to get into Rio de Janeiro in that part of Brazil. If you take a look at the actual topography of Brazil back then, it was so much trees and shrubs and this foliage. Everything was massively overgrown.
Yeah.
It wasn't anywhere near as developed in terms of urban sprawl as it is today.
Well, that's the end on that video. We're going to go over to the next video, which is the psychiatric hospitals in Tartaria and the mental asylums, which I was fascinated by looking into this. What was shocking to me was the imagery inside it.
Yes.
I was blown away.
Absolutely.
And personally, very depressing, actually, looking through it. I got very sad. The first question is from Anna at Jem Bartlett. And she says, I'm confused about one thing. There was mass migration after Great Resets, and yet there were Tartarian buildings in the New World for centuries, including Australia, where I'm from. So doesn't that mean those places already contained Tartarian communities?
They had done, but those communities or societies of Tartarian Aryans in those colonies that had existed and had built and constructed with cymatic-based occult technology and anti-gravity-based occult technology, those edifices, those healing temples in places like Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world, had actually left. They had been evacuated out of those areas because of major climatic upheavals. Mm-hmm. You know, in the past there was massive earthquake and volcanic activity that affected Australia and New Zealand. There was huge fertile areas, actually even as far inland as the Gibson Desert and the Great Australian Desert in central Australia. It wasn't always arid and barren as it is today in terms of its ecology. And so there was areas where it was fertile enough and there was enough soil and concentrations of the right chemicals to grow fruits, vegetables and cereal crops, which is they were basically grown using electroculture, as we've discussed in a previous episode of the Sacred Wisdom podcast.
Wow. Okay.
So this is very, in itself, is what must be understood, is when people leave behind these edifices, they're left as literally monuments to the past, as ways of remembering those people that were there. Just because there's nobody there, it doesn't mean it's not relevant to look at the information. There were people there, but they left, they evacuated those land masses. This was, by the way, this went on in parts of the United States of America and Canada in many of the cities there.
Right.
And that's why when you look, as you know, many of these black and white photographs, there's thousands of these very detailed, high quality black and white photographs, some of which have been taken at high altitude, probably from the roof lines of some of these ornate Tartarian architecture based buildings. And what do you see? Virtually nobody in the cities. They're literally like ghost towns.
It's very strange. I find that so surreal. Some of the 18th century, like 1840, 1850, some of San Francisco, just completely barely empty. It is so surreal. Yet we're told it was swarming with children and orphans and, you know, overpopulated. And
apparently so, from what they say. But again, it seems to be there's a lot of, you could probably even use the phrase photographic contradiction, because it seems to be at odds with a lot of what we're told historically that has, shall we say, officially been told as the norm of the time of what was going on. And academia says in Western science, well, oh no, the cities were very populated, and yet they wouldn't have said to all the thousands of people in one area or a district of one city, can you all just go away from the area so we can photograph this area without you in it? It doesn't make any sense.
Totally agree.
And they're not photographed in the night time, and they didn't have infrared back then either. So they're all done in broad daylight. A lot of the photos were taken during the summertime, where there's a lot more direct sunlight than there is in autumn and winter.
I mean, even in the morning time, you know, there would have still been the odd person walking. These are whole very long streets. The World Fairs, it's something I looked into a lot. I've looked into a lot about the English World Fairs and what's happened in England and London and all this. And you just notice with all the shots, there's never any construction workers. Now, the explanation could be for that, and I just look at it logically. They could have been immigrant workers and they could have been illegal workers. But you think for a construction team, okay, let's just take that story, they were illegal workers. For a construction team or a construction leader to then direct people that were immigrants who didn't speak a word of English, not much construction ability, they would have to be highly technically know their technical skills to build these buildings, and yet it just doesn't seem feasible. So that kind of argument's kind of flawed, really. And there's been a lot of World Fairs in London. They said that during the Victorian age that they built these edifices and buildings and stuff like this, but I just can't see how it was possible.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, absolutely.
And we just keep going round. I mean, I
Yeah.
just wish there was some transparency and disclosure on this.
I think what's happening is there's a lot of inner conflict psychologically for a lot of people, because what's going on is when you look at schools, colleges and universities, how history is being taught, the conventional version of it,
of course,
suddenly here comes all this information on Great Tartaria and Northern Russia, and the evidence is now mounting rapidly. There's so much coming out, so many uploading content all over the internet suddenly, and it's accelerating at quite an exponential rate. You know, people can say, oh, it's all conspiracy theories, but there's so much really very credible evidence.
A photograph can't lie. No. I'm a photographer, so, you know, photographs can't lie. And if you take a photograph, if it was, well, maybe it's lying about the date.
Grain analysis with old photographs can verify if they're fake, if they've been doctored with, you know, Adobe Illustrator, or whether they're actually authentic. And all of them seem to be coming out as authentic.
Yeah.
They have been analysed and they're authentic actual photographic imagery. So that doesn't make any sense to then say, well, that must be all made up. So at some point the threshold is going to be reached where there's going to be so much overwhelming evidence on Great Tartaria being a real civilization that people have to accept that part of our history has been occulted and deliberately suppressed and deleted. And then yet that's leaving the questions open as to why was that done, you know, and what ultimate purpose was served in doing it. I
mean, we can only speculate on that, but it doesn't feel like it for the benefit of us.
No.
And that's certainly, because if it was, this would be transparent information. Museums should be explaining this. Some of the most incredible structures built in the world were built in this period.
Absolutely.
Apparently.
Yeah.
So let's see the documentation to them. We've seen the documentation to all the skyscrapers built in America, and then 30, you know, 500 feet up over New York on these metal pillars. So surely it was possible to photograph a few.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, look, let's get back to the questions. Amazing subject, guys. You know, as you know, everyone into this is mind-blowing, and it gets more fascinating the more you look into it, to be honest. So the next question is from @Laura Kinnar, and she states, that is what I thought from other videos. It sounded like Stephen Denman said the buildings were taken apart in the old country and meticulously reconstructed here. I am not sure if I heard him correctly, though. Explain that a bit, please.
In none of the Sacred Wisdom podcasts, especially this sort of mini-series you've done on Tartaria, the actual 8 that we've done, actually nowhere have I ever said that, and certainly Zach's never said that at all in any of the discussions. What's gone on was the buildings were repurposed. Yeah. So what happened, repurposing doesn't mean, oh, like the old occupants move out and new occupants move in and say, right, we're going to use this building for this purpose. Yeah, that was the ultimate goal, but the buildings were partially demolished, some of them, and were rebuilt with new architectural styles.
Yeah.
And the dismantling of the shall we say, the antennae, these electrical arrays that were, you know, the actual on the roof areas to actually draw down the telluric electricity, because they had to create a system where everybody was paying for the electricity usage. That's part of the reason that was done. So that's why healing temples...
It'd be easier, though, to turn the frequency off in the atmosphere than turn off every building, wouldn't it? So
it would be if that if that occult technology was available to do that on that scale. That'd be quite incredible to have that technology. We don't know whether any kind of weather manipulation technology was even available.
This is pure speculation.
So yeah, so I would say that doesn't make really any sense to then, you know, assume that, you know, that suddenly in Great Tartaria the buildings were all demolished and they were then all the different, you know, the building blocks and the
replaced,
and then suddenly was rebuilt elsewhere. Well, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. We had the first mud flood, the second mud flood, the third mud flood that destroyed thousands of square kilometres, thousands of acres of land, which is one of the reasons there was such a mass influx of, you know, Slavic Russians, Nordic Tartarians, even the Sami or the Laplanders, the various Turkic tribes going into parts of southern Russia, which is why the populations in the towns and cities there started to grow very rapidly.
Yeah.
And this was going on constantly. There's a lot of documentation, unfortunately not in the English language, but in the Cyrillic Russian.
Yeah.
And there's on many blogs and forums, again, in the Russian language. And again, you know, I would urge viewers to really, you know, actually make that effort to seek out that information, go and do your own research on the internet and have a look at that. And you'll find that there's a lot of information that's been held back from audiences in the Western world concerning this, because Western science, the academia, you know, such in places like the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., they're not going to want this information out there because it creates too much of a conflict with what they've established as conventional history.
Yeah, we understand that we must question history. We can't just settle always for what it is. We have, it's going to, like science. Science does the same thing. We question science to make it better, improve it, understand our past, to understand the future better.
We have to understand that the first mud flood, the second mud flood, the third mud flood was so devastating, was so widespread that most of the buildings in the big towns and cities were partially or completely destroyed.
Yeah.
So there's no way that, say, Slavic Russians are going to go in there with construction crews and suddenly start excavating out thousands of tons of silt and mud and gravel to retrieve broken blocks of stone and ornate finishings and the fenestration from the windows and doors. Let's load this onto trains and get this onto passenger ships and transport it to the United States and reconstruct it. That we've never mentioned anything like that at all.
No, it would be very impractical to do that. The Crystal Palace in London once was apparently, which it was actually at Hyde Park, and they moved it 13 miles to Sydenham Hill.
That's right.
But you realise that was pretty impossible in the level of, transportation and going through London in them cobbled streets. It's kind of, I mean, it's a hard story to swallow, and I'm surprised a lot of people that are into history have actually just settled for that story, because I've looked into it a lot, and it's very bizarre. But it goes, the last question, what you're just saying, Steve, goes on to the next question, and that is from, and this is the last question on this episode, and this was from an at D41337 just wish you would link some sources to this research, as it can be difficult to verify the info you guys state in the videos, especially regarding the mud floods, dates and such. Which is a fair point, and I agree with that. I understand that how people can see that, but Stephen's going to explain that. Other than that, great work. So explain a little bit about the mud floods.
Okay, so as we've explained again in previous Sacred Wisdom podcasts, obviously the first mud flood date, the second mud flood date, the third mud flood date, these were concise approximations that were given based on the highest concentration of the destructive phases of the three mud floods.
Yeah.
Combining that with the fact we had, for example, the eruption of Mount Tambora on Sumbawa Island in Indonesia on the 23rd of June 1812.
Which is pretty mental, that was.
It clouded out everything up until the 15th.
30 years, wasn't it?
Yeah, but the eruption lasted until the 15th of July 1815.
Wow.
So when you think that was over 3 years, thousands of square kilometres of sky were literally blocked out for over 3 years. There was mass farming collapse in northern Russia over thousands of square kilometres. They couldn't grow any fruits or vegetables or cereal crops. All the soil was washed away, massive torrential rainfall over that period. Right. You then have got to remember you also had the eruption of Mount Bandai, which was in the Iwashiro province of central Japan on the 15th of July 1888. And then you had the Great Frost that occurred across the United Kingdom of Great Britain, mainland Europe and northern Russia, which occurred from the 16th of November 1890 through to the 20th of January 1891.
Yeah.
And the massive flooding that occurred after the huge inundations, these events are how we calculated and came to these concise actual dates, because you take a look.
Stephen was actually so exact with the dates,
and there was many other
amazing. There's so many geographic. He's researched this down to a T where these dates come.
And I'm just giving some important examples. There were many other volcanic eruptions that took place on Japanese islands and across Southeast Asia as well. And to go into it is very, very detailed. There was a number of great frosts. And you have the periods of the great frost fairs in places like London on the River Thames and also on the River Seine in Paris, in France. So there's a large number of different stuff, and you take all those dates and then you can calculate from those dates the thawing periods when everything was thawing. And there's a lot of records on the thawing rates that took place after the Great Frost because of the inundations that happened.
Yeah, wow. Amazing, Steve. Well, look, that is the end of this episode. We're going to do more on these questions, and I'm going over the questions more, and we're going to do another episode as well on this, so look out for part 2 on this. But until another episode of the Sacred Wisdom podcast, it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.